Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, this is Gwen Salt from NCAI, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining today's presentation entitled Native Education and School Choice 101. Before we get started, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's web event. We're looking at an example of we're looking at an example of a GoToWebinar attendee interface, which is made up of two parts. The viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on your screen, and the control panel at the right. Within that control panel is how you can participate in today's event. So let's take a look. So you will see what you normally see, your audio on your right-hand side. So as you go over to the grab tag, by clicking the first one, you'll notice the orange arrow. You can open and close your control panel. Below it is you can actually minimize it, or you can, if you click it again, it opens up your control panel. You can also view, select, and test your audio that's at the top of the grab tab. You can also view how your audio setup is. It shows you that if you're muted or if your lines is open for you to speak when we get to the question and answers. You also, it will tell you if you have joined the webinars via phone or mic or speaker. There's also an addition of the telephone number where you have to call in, and it gives you a unique audio pin that's pretty much assigned to your webinar when you registered for the webinar. And also, again, this is the PIN number. And also, too, towards the end, this would be very important. If you could use this, click on this icon on your left-hand side to raise your hand when we have any questions, so that we can see what questions. If you raise your hand, that way at the end we'll be able to answer your questions, and that'll be able to be very helpful for us. Also at the bottom, if you want to, in addition to verbally providing a question, you can also give us a question through the chat box at the bottom, and you basically just type it in, and at the end we'll be answering all those questions. So that would be towards the end. The second half will be of today's sessions, and we're hoping at the end there will be a link or email that will tell you about today's surveys and today's sessions, and then we'll have the recorded webinar be made available on our NCI YouTube. So I'd like to introduce and send it to our Executive Director, Jacqueline Pata.
Thank you, Gwen, for opening this webinar for us today, and thank you all that have joined us on the call today. We are really interested in your input, and what we did was just to back up and kind of get you about where we came to and why we're having this webinar today is we wanted to, post-election, we sat down with all the national organizations and had a conversation and said, what are the things that we need to be prepared for Indian country? What are some of the natural conversations that will come out of a changing political environment so that we can be, ready and engaged for those conversations? And clearly, with the education organizations, NIEA and AHEC, we said, we know this conversation, given the president's, at that point, choice and nominee of the secretary that for education, that we knew the conversation was going to be around school choice, vouchers, and and related conversations. And yet, when we were preparing with and reviewing all of our, documents that we had received from tribes up in that year when we were putting together the transition plan from Indian country, we recognized that what we were hearing from Indian country didn't necessarily gel with where we believe the education agenda was going to go. And so this is a new conversation that we needed to engage in. So we pulled together a little bit of a conversation with, some of the education folks here locally, and we said, what do we need to know? How can we even answer this question from Department of Education, from the Secretary of Education, about what does school choice look like for Indian country. Unless we have a better idea of mapping out what is already happening on the ground, and how can we examine what opportunities that we could create in such a dialogue. So, you know, with Indian country, and particularly with NCAI, we're always looking for, can we create a win out of a changing, shifting environment? And not just always be afraid of what those, you know, what those challenges may be, but see, can we reshape the dialogue to make meaningful change for Indian country? And that's exactly what we did. So we partnered with, you know, with NIEA and AHEC and Head Start, and pulled in some other technical experts, you know, Monty Russell and a few other technical experts, to just ask them that question. What do we know about the choices that are available in tribal communities right now? What do we know about tribal governments and their ability to actually be the authorizers or be heavily involved in school, not just school choice, school curriculum, school evaluation, school standards, and certainly, you know, under ESSA, the opportunity of tribes to engage in consultation with states on what school policy will really look like, and how effective are tribes engaging in those opportunities now that they have come forward. So today's webinar is to share with you, tribal representatives, a little bit about what we learned. Now, I want to make it very clear. We are not here putting forward recommendations that we want you to endorse and to move forward. We are here saying this is a dialogue that is happening in this political environment. This is some information that we need to know. What have we learned about what is it that we know is happening on the ground, and how can we use that information, that data, to inform where we go with coming forward with some recommendations that we can all stand behind. We recognize in the past administration there was heavy debates around school, what a school structure looks like, and not all of it was positive. And we also recognize that part of that challenge was it was a top-down kind of conversation. What we're saying is in Indian country, we need to have a ground-up conversation. And so we're prepared, and at our mid-year session in Connecticut, to do a deeper dive on this topic about what have we learned, how can it inform the recommendations going forward. But I also want to remind us that we won't have a lot of time to, you know, think this through, that we've already done a lot of thinking through as we've had this ongoing conversation for the past several years. But from that conversation, is there viable recommendations that we could put forward? So I'm really pleased to turn it over now to Anawake Rose, the Executive Director of NIEA, who will dive a little bit more into this question about what is that tribal choice look like, and how is that informed by some of the current political environment?
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you to everybody that's on the call. I also want to thank you, because you're the ones that really got us to this space to begin with. If it hadn't been for our tribal leaders and NIA's members and our Native education advocates, some of the opportunities that I'm going to walk through and talk about that really got us to a place of being able to even have a viable conversation around choice wouldn't have happened. So it's your continued advocacy, it's your continued support, and it's your continued voice that's raising and elevating this that's going to allow all of us to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that we have in front of us to turn them into the wins that Jackie was talking about before. So as you all hopefully know, in 2015, Congress passed the Every Student Succeeds Act, which included specific provisions that increase the opportunity for tribes to express and to be at the table around Native education. This was an ask that we had been working on for over a decade, and the fact that ESSA created an opportunity not only to require states to consult with tribes, but to require school districts to consult with tribes when they're developing their Title VI, their formerly Title VII, our Indian Ed title programs. And as a result, that means that tribes and Native people are at the table from the beginning, developing a greater role and a greater conversation and relationship in the education of their students, putting us in a place where we're much more well-positioned to have a robust conversation about the day-to-day education of our children. So what does that mean now? We've had this pass in December. We have been developing state plans. We've got a good portion of state plans that have already been turned in and developed. We've got maybe a dozen that are still working that way. If you've not had an opportunity to engage with your state in doing so, please reach out to NIEA because we would love to help you and to ensure that your voice is included within that plan. But we also know with the incoming administration, we heard right from the beginning, we heard right when the president was going around and talking about during his campaign what some of those promises were going to be. We knew that expanding opportunity for school choice was going to be a big debate. And so that's one of the pieces that led us real quickly to have the conversations that we're having today, is figuring out how we can expand choice and opportunity within a Native education system. So immediately we're looking for things within the Department of Education that we can take advantage of, knowing that some programs are going to be eyed as sources of funding as they expand vouchers and as they expand opportunities for charters. And we've also heard conversations about the Bureau of Indian Education being targeted as a potential source of such funds. We saw in the Heritage Blueprint budget that came out several months ago that 90% of their budget they designated under BIE to move into a voucher-like program. So these conversations are really actively taking place within Native education without us. And so for us to be able to quickly regroup and to figure out how do we make this new system, this new era work for us is critically important. So last night, if you all haven't had a chance to dive deep down in the budgets, we had the President's budget came out this morning, and then last night, Secretary DeVos, the Department of Education Secretary, promised that we were going to see the most ambitious expansion of education choice in our nation's history. So that really telegraphed for us what we were going to see within the President's budget that was released today. So what we do know within the Department of Education is that we're going to see $1.7 trillion in proposed cuts to domestic programs and $54 billion increase in defense spending. What we do know is that we're going to see $1 billion of proposed Title I funds to go into a new grant program to expand school portability options, $500 million in additional funding to go to charter schools, and to be able to get those additional funds, we're going to have to see cuts. We have seen a proposed cut in Native education programs, which includes the elimination of our Alaska Native program and our Native Hawaiian education program, and we also saw the elimination of an impact aid line for federal property. Overall, the President's budget includes $9.2 billion in cuts and over a 13% decrease in funding for the Department of Education. We need to be very clear, right, that these are proposed cuts that are coming from the Department of Education, and that it's going to be our ongoing relationship with Congress and with our allies to help reverse and to make certain that these trends that we saw, frankly, in the fiscal year 17 budget that came out continue, and that 18 doesn't see these types of steep cuts. We also need to be very clear that there's opportunities within this budget to figure out ways that we can expand Native education within some of these programs. So you're going to be hearing from both NCAI and NIEA, and I know your other folks that are doing the work around these budgets to ensure that our voice is elevated and to ensure that the trust responsibility is carried throughout the budget and that the relationship that we have with Congress continues to be elevated. You're going to be able, I know, to expect a full budget brief from NCAI in the coming days, and NIEA will be providing one as well. So I'm going to turn over to Matt DeFerranti, who is NIEA's Legislative Director, to talk you through some of the provisions and what the choice landscape currently looks like.
Thanks, Anna-Wake. Really appreciate you providing that context. I'm going to talk about two things. The choice funding landscape. I'm going to briefly go over a few definitions that are part of this conversation that Jackie framed for us and that Anna-Wake teed up. I'm going to talk about some fundamental sort of terms, talk through those definitions briefly so that you have this as a resource. And then I'm going to talk about what choice may mean for tribal communities and how it applies to our communities where there are higher populations of Native students and across the country where there are Native students that we would like to serve. So, first, school choice. It typically is actually talking from the parent or guardian or family's point of view, providing choice for that parent to look at what school they want to go to. So schools of choice are generally innovative schools that are not traditional public schools that may be located near reservations or not the typical model of public education. Schools can include charter schools, immersion schools, private schools, and digital learning. So that's just a couple of key terms for you. School vouchers is, many people feel that that's a key piece of the Secretary DeVos's views with respect to education, and school vouchers are state-funded scholarships that go, that often are focused on low-income students that go to private schools rather than public schools. Their NIEA has a resolution that leads to some concerns regarding vouchers. Vouchers, it's important to note that vouchers have a poor record of supporting student success in rural and reservation areas. So we'll talk more about that as we continue. Tax credit scholarships are another name and another way that some choice advocates try to deliver funding for schools that are non-traditional and that are non-public schools. So it's a tax code way of subtracting taxes owed to the government and then donating to nonprofits who provide private school scholarships. Many tax experts have concerns in this area. It is a policy piece of what Secretary DeVos has been promoting over the last years before she was secretary and now. Education savings accounts are another way of depositing public money, government money, into savings accounts that can go to private education typically. ESAs, as they're called, if they're abbreviated, are less effective in rural and reservation areas. They've been tried in some states like Florida and Arizona in more urban areas. So next, the individual tax credits and deductions. That's another way of using the tax code to try to promote choice. A credit is meant to provide funding for educational expenses, sometimes tuition, supplies, and transportation. So this chart kind of puts it all together. You'll see at the bottom, education savings accounts is ESAs, and if you look at those are the high Native population states, and where these methods of trying to provide choice are highlighted and are available under state law. So ESAs, Arizona, Florida, and Nevada. School vouchers are available in Florida, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Utah, and Wisconsin. Tax credit scholarships, you see Arizona, Florida, the other states. Individual tax credits happen less often. So what you should take away from these slides is that there's a whole different set of ways in which proponents of school choice seek to get funding, typically, to private schools. Now we'll take this big picture terms and definitions and try to talk about schools of choice in tribal communities. Apply this to the students and the systems that we seek to improve so that Native students succeed and realize their dreams, and Native communities realize your dreams as well. So this map kind of provides an overall sense of what I'll talk about a little bit more. There are different types of schools. There are Native charter schools, immersion schools, immersion charter schools, which is a slight hybrid, and then tribally controlled BIE schools, which many of you will know about. This, for the students that we serve, for Native students, this is the sort of landscape that led me earlier to say choice means something somewhat different in many of our communities than it has meant in Michigan, where Secretary DeVos is from. Charter school, here's just a definition. Charter schools are publicly funded. They're different from the choice landscape in that they can be considered part of choice schools, but they're different in that they're not public money going to private schools. So they're publicly funded independent schools established by teachers, parents, or community groups under the terms of a charter that is granted by a state, local government, or tribal government in some cases, particularly in Oklahoma at this stage. So that's what a charter school is. We hope that many other states will allow tribes to authorize charter schools over the years to come, and NCAI and NIEA will be supporting those efforts. Those are charter schools. Here's an example of a charter school from the Seminole Reservation in Glades County, Florida. NIEA recently visited this school. The whole effort that NIEA is engaged in is Native control of Native education. So this is an example of a school that integrates Creek language and culture into the classroom for all students, because we know that language and culture are so critical for identity and success for our students. Next, I'll talk about immersion schools, and this is a key priority for NIEA, was in the Every Student Succeeds Act and has been for years. These are schools that utilize native languages as the primary language of instruction in the classroom. There's so much successes, and we'll have some comments later from Chairman Payment regarding immersion schools, but there's so much evidence that these are successful because Native students need to see themselves and their cultures and families in the schools that they attend in order to succeed. So those are immersion schools. An example that's often cited is the Lacourt Aurelius Ojibwe School. Ojibwe is integrated into the classroom to ensure a bilingual education movement. What we've been pushing for is for state assessments, at least through grade 8, to be given in these schools exclusively in native languages, so that students can succeed and can see themselves and gain the critical cultural education that they'll need, and the education that they need through 8th grade. Next, I'll talk about private schools as distinct. I just think it's important to mention independent schools operated totally outside, or almost completely outside of the public school system. The laws that apply for students with disabilities are different and much reduced. In some cases, don't apply at all for private schools, and there's typically a lack of public funding. Private schools are free to develop and implement a curriculum tailored to the needs of students within that community without limitations. So vouchers, ESAs, and other school choice options help fund the fully private schools that exist. Private schools are pretty rare in Native communities, and they're less of a choice option for many students. The Red Cloud Indian School is an example of a private school located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. So the curriculum can be tailored specifically to the students in that community, but there's not public funding that supports the school unless it's through one of these education savings account type mechanisms. So the last type, and then I'll wrap up, the sort of general piece, is there's also long distance learning options and online and virtual schools that have popped up in many locations. They can supplement or they can replace courses in the traditional classroom, and all of the funding mechanisms that I described can be used to pay for the costs associated with virtual schools. It's important to note that virtual and online schools might look quite differently depending on if you're teaching younger students, and as you get towards older students who are doing more research type projects and can learn independently more often, these schools might look different. So There's the Fort Washakie Academy of Virtual Education. It's on the Wind River Indian Reservation in Wyoming. In some cases, these can be successful. Don't know that there's a ton of these schools at the moment operating in high Native population states. So with that, I'll wrap up here. I'll talk about magnet schools, and then we'll ask Denise with NCAI to talk a little bit about some of the barriers to choice schools. Magnet schools have been around for some time. They're non-traditional public schools designed to attract more diverse student body that offers special instructions. So there could be a theme like science and technology, STEM, science, technology as an example, fine arts, languages. They're focused on a specific theme typically. And magnet schools in Native communities can integrate Native culture, language, and curricula, but have yet to be really implemented throughout the country. So now I'll turn it over. I've talked about the national choice landscape and what choice means in Native communities and for tribal nations. Now we'll talk about, I'll send it to Denise Desiderio, Policy and Legislative Director for NCAI, to talk about challenges to choice for tribal nations.
Thank you, Matt. As we have this discussion about education, we have to also look at the climate that we're in right now politically and the conversations that are occurring around the budget. As Anawake mentioned earlier, we're looking at significant budget cuts in Congress around education funding. We are also, but there are two ways to kind of decide whether you're going to implement programs. You can start the program through hiring freezes. We're also facing reorganizations at each of the departments right now that have been mandated by executive order. So we're looking at Congress for the budgetary issues. We're looking at hiring freezes and restructuring that will have significant impacts on education programs at the Department of Interior and at the Department of Education. If we look at the ESSA, as Anawake mentioned earlier, there are some opportunities for tribes to have a greater voice in how the state plans have been implemented and for tribes to kind of engage better at the state level. I think that's something that can continue given the high emphasis on local control right now in Congress and in the administration. However, there have been several legislative efforts to kind of water down that requirement in ESSA. So we're also looking at what's happening legislatively in Congress, the House especially, on how that will be implemented at the Department of Interior. The appropriations landscape, we are looking at Congress to restore some of the proposed cuts that we're seeing, especially in Native Hawaiian and Alaska Native titles in ESSA, but what was I saying? But we also have the Tribally Controlled Schools Act, which has never been fully funded. We have legislation that will be introduced by Senator McCain shortly, the School Choice Act, which we understand will be introduced again. So there's a lot going on in Congress that we have to keep an eye on, as well as the school choice conversation happening at the Department of Education. One of the conversations that's been happening since the campaign and that President Trump has really emphasized is infrastructure. We think that there will be a really robust conversation on infrastructure in Congress this year. We're still waiting for the administration's proposals around infrastructure. But when we think about education, it's really not isolated in the conversations that have been happening. In Indian country, we're talking about housing, transportation, broadband. All of these issues have a significant impact on education as well. Take construction of school facilities. The Bureau of Indian Education still has a $1.3 billion backlog, and 60 of its 183 schools are listed in poor condition. Those statistics have remained, and we've really lacked the influx of funding. to really be able to have a significant impact on that. Compared to Department of Defense schools, the other federally funded school system, which has had a $3 billion commitment of funding for its 133 schools worldwide. So we're still seeking parity in how our school facilities are treated, and that's just at BIE. It really doesn't account for the public schools that are on Indian lands that are also in poor condition. Broadband is a really key issue. We've heard from one tribe that their broadband connection is so lacking that their students actually have to go about an hour and a half to take mandated tests that are mandated to be done electronically. This is something that we're talking about with the FCC, and we're really looking at ways to increase the opportunities for schools and Indian country to have better access to broadband and telecom. You know, and then housing. Housing shortages remain a key barrier to attracting teachers to Indian lands. So when we did a budget briefing just yesterday in the Senate, we were mentioning that as we look at, you know, teacher recruitment, law enforcement recruitment, medical professional recruitment, that we have to address the housing issues holistically, or we're only fixing part of the problem. I've mentioned transportation briefly. One thing that I wanted to hit on is a report that the General Accounting Office has been conducting for about a year and a half now, and that just is going live today. The report is called Tribal Transportation, Better Data Could Improve Road Management and Inform Indian Student Attendance. So I think that this is a good look at why some of the reasons that student attendance is impacted by transportation. I think what's really good about this report is that it's not just isolating education. So we tend to look at some of our issues in silos, and what we're really encouraging the administration and Congress to do is kind of look at our programs across the government and see how things like transportation are impacting attendance, or see how issues like housing are impacting the ability to attract teachers. So that's something that we will continue to work on. It's something that we'll continue to need input on as we look at how to better improve the quality of education for Native students. And as we talk about data, there's also other ways that we're looking at data collection. You know, we really need to, in Congress, every time we go to Congress and we say that there are, that we can show that Native language and culture in the classroom has a significant impact on our student graduation rates. What they always are seeking is data. Data is going to become increasingly important, and as we look at the president's budget today, you know, some of the terms that we're hearing are that that the administration is looking for ways to show through data that that federal programs have helped people to succeed. You know, so I think tribes have probably the best story out of anyone for self-determination and self-governance. This is nowhere more important than in education, but we need the data to track what we know is kind of working in our communities, and that's where this conversation is really helpful, because I think we can, through our engagement with, you know, tribal leaders, school boards, educators, really find out where things are working in Indian country and create those best practices and learn from each other. So I'm going to turn it over to Anawake now to talk about tribal innovation for school choice.
Thanks, Denise. So if you can see the progression of the work that we did as organizations through the progression of the slides that we've provided here today, as we started to think about how Indian country could engage in the conversation, we first needed to understand the political context of which the administration was walking into the conversation. We then needed to actually have a really good grasp of what choice was, how those funding mechanisms were being used and provided to states, and what the terminology was. Because as you saw from the map that Matt provided and showed us earlier, There really is very little opportunity for the currently defined opportunities of choice within our high population states and within our communities. Then we needed to have a really good understanding of what the limitations were, what some of the barriers were that we were facing. And then the next step is to understand how innovation, or if innovation, is currently taking place within our school systems and with our environments. And we're really excited to tell you that it is. So even without expanded opportunities, specifically legislatively or funding-wise for Indian country or for Native schools, as Native people, we do what we always do. When there is a gap, we fill that and we become our own innovators. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those tribal innovations look like and what we see to be immediate opportunities and examples that we would like to show you that we're thinking about, and maybe that you have others within your communities that you can share and elevate with us so that we can continue to learn from some of the really amazing things that are taking place within our school communities. First, we need to really recognize the beauty behind the Tribally Controlled Schools Act. So under PL 297, we have authority as tribes to establish schools to operate a huge variety of mechanisms, right? You have a huge amount of flexibility in developing your own curricula. You have a huge amount of flexibility in developing your lesson plans and teachers and in hiring structures. So we really want to help celebrate what flexibility there is already available in 297. However, we know that you're also under a lot of restrictions in how that law is being implemented. And so please let us know what's happening right now within your systems that are prohibiting you from exercising the statutory authority that you should have been provided. We really want to find ways that we can lift and elevate our opportunities of choice that you all fought so hard to establish under PL 297. We want to make sure that our tribal governments and our school boards are working together in a really collaborative way to help engage and work with our students to provide them the best school systems that we can within these communities. I also want to highlight for you a school of choice in New Mexico, and this is NACA, the Native American Community Academy. What's so exciting about NACA is that not only is it within an urban environment, it actually integrates Native culture, traditions, and community into the classroom. They teach Navajo, they teach Lakota, and the Tiwa language. So they have been an incredible example of a cross-collaborative approach between the multiple communities that are residing within Albuquerque. And I believe that they had a 97% graduation rate, is what I heard Kara, who's their executive director, speak about. NACA is not just successful within Albuquerque. They've actually been able to provide training and opportunities to some of our other communities as well so that we can learn from them. So this innovative approach of being able to utilize immersion practices through chartering within an urban district and being authorized through a public school district is something that we're trying to learn from as we work to identify best practices and promising opportunities across our communities. Another school that we want to talk about is the Cherokee Immersion School. So this school is operated by the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. It serves preschool through 6th grade students, and it integrates Cherokee cultural perspectives while meeting the Oklahoma achievement standards. What's really interesting about this school is that it combines different types of school choice into a uniquely Native choice model. So it resides within a grant and charter school. So initially it was a 297 school that Cherokee Nation contracted and compacted to run. And then through the flexibility provided within that school, opened up and expanded an immersion school. This is what we're really wanting to hear about within your communities is, are there other examples of these types of practices where you've been able to utilize existing flexibility options to create a school of choice that works well? And what have you learned along the way, and what barriers to those successes might we be able to help lift and remove from you as you're continuing through your work? We know that there's multiple other examples. These were just two that we wanted to highlight, plus bring out the importance of the 297 law to give you an idea of where we're trying to lead with our work. And as we're thinking about the next steps and ways to engage a larger community within this conversation, what we're hoping that we can learn from others. So in closing, we're going to turn it over to Chairman Aaron Payment, who is going to walk us through a conversation around items that our working groups and our organizations, or the working group that we would like to pull together and our organizations are currently engaged in as we think about the next steps. Chairman?
Ani, bonjour. This is Aaron Payment calling from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. As you may know, I serve as an executive officer for NCAI. I'm the liaison to the HR committee and co-chair for the NCAI education subcommittee. But more importantly, I'm a high school dropout with 3 graduate degrees and almost I'm in dissertation phase in education, and my theme and topic is increasing the graduation rate for American Indians in high school and college. And so I live this. This is what I'm excited. I'm not collecting data right now, I promise you, but I'm very excited to be participating in this. So I wanted to say just real quickly, you know, we're talking about choice. That's the environment that we're in. We have a secretary that's actually from Michigan, Secretary DeVos, and the president selected her because of her background and choice. So we're not taking a position, NCAI is not taking a position one way or another on schools of choice or those issues. What we're doing is instead what we're doing is saying, given this is the landscape, we're looking at what opportunities may exist for Indian country in this new landscape. And so I want to be careful that we're not getting in the middle of a battle between public schools and choice and charter schools and any of that. And what we're trying to do is just to be facilitative of information and also bringing some best practices together so that tribal nations can look at that and see in a self-determined way what would work for them. And so we're trying to facilitate and engage. And so with that, we would like to pose a couple of questions to try to get this going. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a dialogue and then stimulate interest and attendance at our mid-year, which is going to be happening in June, just a couple weeks from now, at the Mohican tribal community, and create interest so that we can continue the dialogue. What NCAI and NIEA and our partners are doing is just trying to facilitate the dialogue so that when the administration comes and asks, we can say, here's what we found, but we urge you to work directly with tribes in a self-determined way. So we're respectful of that. Self-determination is always our main goal for all of our organizations. And so when we think of some questions to consider, and these are some just to stimulate and get ready to start sending some questions to Gwen, and we'll try to, she will try to field some of those questions to the time that we'll have left today, but also keep the questions coming because we're going to pull these all together and we're going to summarize those questions when we do come together at our mid-year conference, again in a couple more weeks in June. So one of the questions is, should tribes have the authority to authorize charter schools in states other than Oklahoma? If you think back to the slide we saw where tribes in Oklahoma are able to authorize charter schools, and so should other states be, tribes in other states be permitted to do that? Given current school options in many Native American communities, our schools of choice programs, are these effective? And if so, which types are effective? And then how can the working group, this working group that we're calling ourselves, best support your endeavors to create choice in Indian country? So those are just some of the questions off the top of my head. And then just one final thing is my tribe does have both a tribal grant school, a BIE school, but also a state charter. And so we're one of those ones that have done it kind of creatively. But if you go back to that slide again, you can see there's a lot of different permutations and different options where tribes have said, we don't like the way this is going. We're going to take this over, and here's how we're going to do it. And so we promote self-determination. So there's just a couple of the questions, and I will be part of our session again at the mid-year to help facilitate engagement and excitement about what does this choice represent for Indian country. And with that, Gwen, I think we're going to start taking some questions.
All right, and as Aaron mentioned, NCI will be holding a session on envisioning the future of Indian education. We mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that this is really the beginning of the dialogue, and we look forward to having a further, more in-depth discussion with everyone at mid-year, which is Tuesday, June 13th from 1:30 to 4. So I hope that everyone can make it there. We do have a few questions that came in that we would like to address to the panel. So our first question is whether tribes can authorize charter schools now.
Matt, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So in the state of Oklahoma, tribes can authorize charter schools. In other states, it's a state-by-state law situation, and unfortunately, no other states have taken advantage of that and passed laws to allow for that. That doesn't mean that tribes, of course, there are tribally controlled schools through BIE, but states themselves have been of course, have been a challenge in the distant history and sometimes right through to today. But we are encouraging and working to try and expand the number of states beyond Oklahoma where where tribes can authorize charter schools themselves.
In fact, that's one of the things that we've been really trying to explore, and would love to have more comments from folks as you think through this. You know, there was a thought that, you know, that tribal governments would be able to, you know, accept that responsibility, recognizing, you know, through some kind of legislative process, or perhaps even tribes and some of the tribes who may not have the initial capacity around authorizing or feeling comfortable about authorizing a charter school process, that they could actually partner within a region, for example, or tribes coming together collectively, but clearly still under tribal authority doing this authorization. We kind of feel like that's kind of critical, tribal authorization. It's key for when we think about a lot of other kinds of things that are coming down at the tribal level. But certainly would love to hear more from tribes about what do they think about that, or is there other mechanisms that would work. We also even explored, you know, would an authorizing body, such as like BIE, for example, have some authorizing ability for those tribes who may not readily feel like they want to take on that responsibility. So love to hear your guys' thoughts, but I think this whole issue about tribal authority to authorize is really an important part of the dialogue.
And one last piece to that conversation too, there are states that currently do not allow chartering at all, our North Dakota and South Dakota friends. And so if there are opportunities to think about ways that we could use other establishments, for example, utilizing current BIE structures and framework to either allow a charter within those states or use BIE as the authorizer itself. We're really interested in examining and finding those types of innovative solutions as well, because we do want to make sure that all of our tribes have equal opportunity and accessibility to the pieces that we're working through. So if those two states explicitly prohibit, as well as some other states that we're working through, we would love to hear from our school board members and from our Native teachers and our tribes within those states about possible solutions and ideas you might have as well.
Jackie, can I say one more thing? This is Aaron again. So I'm a former president of a charter school and a tribal grant school in Michigan, and I'm now more recently a member of the Board of Regents of the Bay Mills Community College. So in Michigan, colleges and Bay Mills Community College uniquely in Michigan are able to charter schools. And so one of the possibilities going forward would also potentially be to charter through the tribal colleges.
And to follow up on the charter school conversation, we have a question about how are charter schools similar and how are they different from tribally controlled schools?
So the first thing I should say is that within charter schools, there's pretty significant variety. But charter schools are typically, they're funded through state budgets, and they have independent, many of the laws that apply to traditional public schools are more flexible for charter schools. It's also the case that many charter schools don't get facilities funding and get outside private foundation money to supplement charter schools. So that's charter schools, traditional charter schools. The question about tribal charter schools and tribally controlled schools is that Public Law 297, the Tribally Controlled Schools Act, it essentially provides the guidelines, the limited guidelines under which tribally controlled schools can operate. There's some specific requirements for an audit and a few other items, but rather than the big flexibility that sometimes comes for charter schools, tribally controlled schools are authorized through the BIE, and there's this Public Law 297 provides the specific statutory framework, the requirements, plus some flexibility. And I'm sure there are folks on this call who feel as though there should be more flexibility. There are instances where NIEA and NCAI, we want to make sure that there's flexibility. And so there's that specific piece. Tribally controlled schools are under the BIE and already have a set law that governs them. Traditional charter schools vary quite a bit from state to state.
Thank you. We have one statement about funding for tribal education, and that is that funding for education is actually in many treaties with tribes. And I think that is a true statement, and I think that we wish that the federal government and Congress would fully fund all of the obligations under our treaty and trust obligations that they have for tribes. But what we're seeing is that that's actually been challenging in the last few years, and I think we're entering a climate where it's going to be a larger challenge than we've had. I will tell you that NIEA and NCAI's efforts to educate new members of the administration about treaty rights and the trust obligations have been ongoing, and that we're going to continue those conversations as well as with Congress. We are right now, as we are all on this webinar, we've got lots of folks looking at the president's budget. We'll be doing an analysis of that and sending that out as soon as possible, either later today or early in the morning, so that we can see what the president's budget contains for education and for other tribal programs. As Anawake mentioned earlier, just caution everybody that the president's budget is really considered more of a policy statement than what will actually be enacted. So we will be vigilant in our meetings and our work with Congress to make sure that there is still a keen understanding, of the requirement to fund programs for tribes, not because they're entitlement programs or because they are racially based, but because tribes are political entities with treaty and trust rights. One of the other questions that we have is whether Montana has ever authorized any charter schools, since that is actually something that's covered by state budgets.
That's a great question. I'm just trying to flip back to our chart on that. I don't believe that Montana has authorized charter schools. Let me just confirm that while we're working here.
We got a comment in while Matt is looking that up, that Montana has a weird relationship with charter schools. Maybe by someone from Montana. And the other thing, you know, as we're beginning to wrap up the webinar that I want to mention, we have a lot of questions about whether the webinar will be available in the PowerPoint. We will post the webinar online shortly, so the entire webinar will be available, as will the PowerPoint slides. And we've had a large number of questions, so we will also work to get answers back to everyone who sent questions in, because I know sometimes time is limited. And I think we probably have time for maybe one more question. And that question.
Sure. So I don't want to speak for the Montanan on the phone, but I do. We did confirm that traditional charter schools don't appear to be authorized currently under Montana law. Now there are immersion schools and other innovative schools, a few that we were able to pick up in Montana, but I do not see a specific authorizing law that creates charter schools in Montana. Certainly, if we find out something different from the Montanan after the webinar, then we'll be sure to correct our PowerPoint before sending it out. But charter schools not currently authorized in Montana, as we understand it.
And we have, I want to kind of combine two questions into one. And one question is from someone involved in education with their tribe, who wants to know how they can raise the idea of school choice and charters to their tribal government. And the second is from an educator who would like to work or learn how to work and be part of a movement that develops curricula around culture and language, and how to kind of be part of a kind of a curricular sovereignty and self-determination agenda.
Well, both of those are great questions, and questions that I know both NCAI and NIEA would be happy to work with you on. To the first question about school choice and tribal governments, I think it's critical to go to the tribal council meetings and raise this issue, and also seek out like-minded individuals in your community, because one individual focusing on education is not nearly as powerful as a small group. So in states, NIEA is seeking to build advocate groups of 6 to 10 individuals who are speaking out in favor of Native control of Native education and Native education more generally, both at the state level and before tribal councils. So that's, NIEA would love to serve as a resource for you on that first question. With respect to educators looking for curriculum, that's, I think, a question that would be both Anawake, but Diana Canoyer on our team is our program director, and she has been working to create a resource repository. But she would also love to talk with you about the critical effort to make sure that culture and Native leadership and Native educators are foremost at the table, because the history of not fully including Native educators is way too long, and that's, we think, part of the problem. So Diana Canoyer would be the right person on the second, and in the follow-up, we will have a system for getting in touch, both with, of course, Diana and the NIEA team, and Jackie and Denise and the NCAI team.
All right, we are about we're at the top of the hour. I just want to say thank you for joining in today's session. We're hoping that at the upcoming NCAI mid-year conference, this conversation will continue, and we really look forward to tribal participation. This very important conversation regarding our children's education. So again, I want to thank you for joining us. We will be, as Denise mentioned, we will be posting a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint. We'll be getting those to you, and we'll be following up with questions that we were unable to answer. So I just want to say thank you. Have a good afternoon.